They have their own priorities, their own funding structures. Progress in one field may not be looked upon favorably in another. The pace can be very different. Some fields are going to prioritize advancement in the science a bit more than the engineering. And so being really successful in doing interdisciplinary science, I think, means accepting some of that friction and being willing to work through those parts and getting these different spaces to interface and work together.
Namaskar and welcome to another episode of the Professor Mahesh podcast, your resource to help you make informed career decisions. As we like to think, this is your future simplified. This podcast is brought to you by IIT Madras Global. IITM Global stands for everything that is IIT Madras that the global audience needs to be benefiting from. Our teaching, our research, our startups, our entrepreneurship, our inventions and patents. Come learn more about the most recent efforts of IITM Global in the description in the link in the below. The world of electronics meeting life as we know it has been a passion, a pursuit, a desire for a very long time. It's been on the minds of academicians for ever since probably electronics came around. But today we hear of all of these very exciting prospects around where potentially electronics could be implanted, ingested, digested, and I don't know what else. Therapeutics are the desire largely. To help us parse this very exciting world, and this is not a world that is way out there, I have Professor Srinivasan from Harvard. Shriya is a graduate of Harvard and currently a faculty member in the School of Applied Sciences. Thank you, Shriya, for making the time.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here.
You know, this world of electronics meeting life, we hear of ideas like the Neuralink and how far are we from one of these being, say, commercially available?
I think not so far off. Many of these companies are, already in human clinical trials. So it could be just a matter of a couple of years before it's available for patients that need them. I think on a more consumer scale, it will take probably a decade and a half, just for us to really vet the safety, work out the kinks with utility and use cases.
And what's the aspiration? What's the big vision here?
In the field of the brain-computer interface or the human-machine interface, I think the vision is to have, a seamless way to transfer data between the brain and other systems to be able to send and receive and integrate. For, I think, human-machine interfaces, the vision here more is about rehabilitation, augmentation, making things like moving around in the world much more seamless and easy, effortless. Yeah.
And you often think about feedback, not just in machines, but also in the human body. We have our own active feedback circuits. Do they anticipate these sort of interfaces to be two-way in some way?
Most of them today are designed to be one-way. Okay. But I think without that bi-directional feedback and communication, it will be challenging for them to be very easy for us to use, right? Our bodies are naturally attuned to sending information and receiving it and closing that loop. If we keep that to be an open loop process, I think that is a challenge for a lot of prosthetic devices and in general, these sorts of brain-computer interfaces as well.
How did you get into this discipline? Where did you start? Where did you grow up?
So I came at it from a kind of a pure curiosity and interest in how we can interface with the nervous system, whether it's philosophers or folks in the various disciplines over the course of time. I think humanity has always sought to understand how the mind works, how the brain works. It's kind of the final frontier for how our bodies are controlled, how we regulate emotion, how we think about concepts and interact with one another in the world. And so I had that curiosity to understand. And to really be able to dive in and understand, we need to then be able to interface the nervous system. And so that was kind of the driving force at a very deep level to get into this space. At a more practical level, I think I've worked with movement in various forms throughout my life. Growing up, I learned dance, and I'm a dancer as well. And so a lot of my time has been spent in, much practice, and physically feeling what movement feels like and how to optimize that movement. And I also interacted with patients, family members that had had movement disabilities. And so putting that kind of all together, I really wanted to work on neural interfaces for the periphery and study movement and see how we could recreate movement and sensation. Again, to close that loop between movement and sensation is critical.
Let's start. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you went to school?
I went to school there, and then I went to Case Western for my undergraduate studies. I studied biomaterials and biomedical engineering.
Very good.
And I went to MIT to a program called the Health Sciences and Technology Program, which is between Harvard Medical School and MIT,
Sure.
Where I did my PhD. And then after that, I did a postdoc with professors Giovanni Traverso and Bob Langer. And that's, and then after that, I went into a faculty position.
Wonderful. I think let's start with drawing sort of a pen picture of what this field of bioengineering looks like. What are all the ideas that are encompassed that fall under this large umbrella of bioengineering?
It kind of breaks down as the interface between biology, physiology, medicine, and our traditional engineering disciplines, chemical engineering, mechanical, electrical, computational. I would say that's like a broad way to think about this space. So, for example, in the biomaterials field, you would think about what sort of materials can I apply, say, in a dressing for a wound? And how would those materials, how can we engineer them to, say, release drugs or protect that site and optimize that using engineering principles to then best interface the biology, right? How that wound heals, what the inflammatory properties are, what the drugs are that need to be delivered to heal the wound. That would be, say, for in the biomaterial space. So we're talking about like engineering polymers, materials, etc. If we then think about bioelectronics, we're asking questions of, how do we perhaps learn about the nervous system and model it as a circuit? Or how do we use electronics to stimulate the nervous system, for example? So that might be a bioelectronics application.
So this could be like deep brain stimulation for treating epilepsy and such.
Right. It's everything from that all the way to implanted pacemakers, to wearable devices that maybe sense your activity levels and then modulate. So that would be like a bioelectronics example. And then you have computational sciences, you have the mechanical engineering, a lot of kind of rehabilitation engineering falls under that. Devices fall largely under mechanical. But I would say the field is quite interdisciplinary, and there are some blurred lines between these traditional disciplinary silos.
Sure. What would be sort of the high-level constraints on designing a bioelectronic device, let's say, versus a consumer electronic device? I mean, just to sort of compare and contrast, what are the kinds of issues that one would need to be cognizant of in designing something bio?
It really depends on the use case, right?
Okay.
Whether it's wearable or implantable, or it's a measurement and sensing device, or it's simulation. So yeah, I think it would depend case to case, but at a very high level, when we think about designing bioelectronics, perhaps one of the common things that we think about is compatibility. Is it going to harm the tissues in any of its functionalities? And how can it gel with the way that the human body perhaps processes signals already? And so mimicking biology or working very closely to how the biology and the physiology already function is generally the very, very high level constraint. But in each case, we would take the specific design requirements for a given application.
And use materials that are sort of known to be compatible and not produce toxic side effects in some way.
That's right.
If a student was to sort of get excited about this whole discipline, How much physiology and anatomy would the student need to learn a priori before, let's say, going into the field like this?
I
Did
think,
you develop an understanding of that space?
yeah, learning the physiology, the medical side of it, I think is very important. Without a deep understanding of that side, I think it's hard to develop meaningful devices, tools, methods in this biomedical engineering space. So as much as you have strength in the engineering fundamentals, the physics, the math, I think you also need to develop an equal strength in understanding the body and how it works.
And did you, at what stage of your training did you do that? Was it at Case Western at the undergrad level, or was it later on in your graduate studies?
Even in my high school, I had taken a fair amount of biology, chemistry, physics, and so I had the fundamentals there. And then during my undergraduate training, I took classes in both basic physiology, biology, chemistry, organic chemistry, as well as, pre-medical classes that were on the pathway to, a career for medicine. But the biomedical engineering curriculum itself incorporated classes that had physiology and anatomy built in, side by side with engineering. And then again, in my graduate studies, more classes that, again, deeply integrated these two disciplines. One of the interesting things about learning biomedical engineering, I think, is you get to think about the body like a machine, right? So the heart is a pump. Our vessels are all just tubes. You think about it at a systems level, just like you would
An engineer,
an electromechanical device. Yeah.
Like a chemical engineering plant, right? Actually, that's a good point to sort of segue into the fundamental philosophy. A doctor or medical education largely starts by assuming everything is interconnected. It's one big complex system. We engineers are used to a reductionist approach of, breaking systems down to subsystems, and we are used to the idea of interfaces between subsystems. How would you parse these two words? In other words, when you talk to an MD and you do what you sort of treat everything by systems that are connected by weak interfaces, what you're assuming essentially is that this system can function largely autonomously with inputs alone. Is that where would you learn that? I mean, how would you learn these conversations? How would you learn the skill to have these conversations?
With doctors or with various subsystems?
With doctors broadly. And then how would you bring this community together?
Yeah. I mean, at this interdisciplinary interface, you do have to understand the priorities of each and learn to speak a little bit of the language of both sides to have those conversations fluidly. And to do that, I think taking the classes is the key.
So you can speak their language in, with the fluency that they speak in some way.
Yes. I think establishing depth, right, in the engineering and an equivalent amount of depth in whatever subfield of medicine or subfield of physiology that I'm going to interface is very important. And I think spending that time then allows you to go between the different stakeholders and have intelligent conversations, ask the right questions, propose the ideas and say, do you think this is going to work? Would this be useful to you? Would you actually meaningfully use it? And often the answer is no. And you get a lot of criticism, and I think that's great. Too often, I think engineers develop things that are not truly useful by the end users in this space.
See, the idea of a heart as a pump or a kidney as a filter are probably relatively easy to understand. But there are other systems like the GI that you will get to that. Would the argument, when you go to talk to a GI intestinologist or gastroenterologist, would they accept the idea that this is a system standalone by itself and like a heart is a pump?
I don't think so. The GI system is uniquely interconnected to so many different organ systems in the body. It's quite complex and operates at a bit more complexity than, say, the heart. But even then, I think the heart also is interconnected to so many other systems. So to some degree, for certain problems, I think you can isolate them as a subsystem and deal within, that set of constraints. But for many problems, you do have to see it in the context of the full system.
Yeah. We'll get to the GI in a little more detail later on, but I want to go back to biomedical engineering as a discipline. It started out with electronics being diagnostics and largely diagnostics with X-rays and CT, MRI and all of that we know. And then we are slowly moving into therapeutics. What are some early victories? I mean, there are already, like you mentioned, pacemaker is a great example of a biomedical device that's a therapeutic and it's implantable. Are there other such devices that are sort of in the offing, and where is that excitement? And let's also not discount the diagnostic side of things. What are some ideas you hear among your colleagues in the broader space of biomedical engineering?
Cochlear implants have been a real victory for the field. Very old technology, but extremely useful and efficient. And so that's a good example of a technology that made it and really showed the potential of bioelectronics. Many of the systems that we use today are modeled off of the similar principles, where you're receiving some sort of input from the external environment and then stimulating the nervous system to communicate that. Pacemakers are another good example of bioelectronics that have really worked. Wearable devices now, you're wearing the Apple Watch, I see, and it's sensing much of your physiology and letting you know about trends that are occurring on a daily, monthly basis. And those have also shown good promise. And I think as we continue to integrate more of the information that's sensed, we'll have pretty good insights about how the physiology functions. Now, I think to take that a step further, closing the loop and being able to stimulate in an intelligent way, in a dynamic, adaptive way to the physiology will be key to making these really useful in the future.
Let's get to the GI back again. And this has been your pursuit for some time now. Ingestible electronics, it almost sounds science fictional. What are some ideas that students in your lab are working on, or your colleagues around the world?
Yeah. So the high-level concept is that you ingest a capsule that contains onboard sensors and actuators, and that it will travel down the GI tract through each segment. So the oral cavity, the esophagus, the stomach, small intestine, large intestine, the anorectal areas. It'll be able to sense things like pH, temperature, pressure. It could sense the electrophysiology. So what are the neural signals in the region? It could sense chemical entities, biomarkers, perhaps for certain diseases. Integrate all of this. These ingestible devices often have very low power components because powering is challenging. And then use this information to potentially actuate, right, to treat. So that treatment could look like electrical stimulation. It could look like optical stimulation, mechanical stimulation, different sorts of, functions. People have also toyed with ideas of, having little graspers or hooks that could take biopsies of tissues, for example, or collect samples of your microbiome to be analyzed later. There are already devices on the market that have cameras in them, capsule endoscopes that can take pictures and let you know what the health is and the state of your GI tract. And many of these devices pass through the tract, but there are some that are designed to be resident in the tract. So gastric resident devices, a very interesting one that Professor Traverso's group developed, is this star-like device. So it folds up, you swallow it, and then once it enters the stomach, it opens and is then too large to leave because it can't go through that sphincter to get out. And so there it continues a function. And in the first case, it was basically drug delivery. And so it would do extended drug delivery. And then after a point in time, each of the arms would degrade. And then eventually the device would become small enough that all of it passes. Wow. And so you can imagine other sorts of resident devices that live in other parts of the tract. And so the thinking is that we could have sort of localized sensing and then treatment. And we can use the gut as a way to understand what the internal organs are doing, how the body is feeling, what you're eating, how it's being metabolized, and modulate things like energy balance, mood, motility, satiety. Yeah.
And you mentioned power. For a device like this to be resident in the gut for an extended duration of time, What are some ideas that are being discussed to overcome power as a challenge?
Wireless power has been explored. It's feasible, but you cannot, there are constraints just because of the anatomy and how deep set these organs are, as well as alignment, right? I think because the gut is continually moving and having continual peristalsis during phases, and these organs are somewhat mobile within the thoracic abdominal cavity, to align a fixed device to send and receive is a little bit more challenging. In contrast, when you have peripheral nerve implants, for example, that sit subcutaneously, you can position something to send and receive, and it's relatively stable. So power harvesting has been explored from both the chemicals in the gut, for example, the acid, from the actual movement of the tract, if we can harvest that mechanical energy. They all tend to be a little bit challenging in terms of how much power you can harvest and then use. But emerging ideas, so I think we'll have to take a few years to see what pans out in this space.
I think the holy grail there may just be to use the body's own source of energy. If there is a way to harvest that energy directly, as you are as part of the two-way interface. You mentioned gut microbiome. Tell us a little bit about this idea. Tell us a little bit about what is the gut microbiome and why is there so much attention lately on it?
I'm really not an expert in this space.
Okay.
But the gut microbiome is basically the collection of microbes that live in the mucosal layers, largely in the small and large intestine. That's the area of high interest. And these populations change based on your genetics, your environment, your food, and other things like your disease state, even your mood. And so there's a lot of interest in studying the microbiome because it could be a very high signal indicator of physiological state, of potentially diseases. It could be an early indicator of things like flare-ups in certain inflammatory conditions. And modulating the microbiome has proven to be very effective for certain diseases where you have, with antimicrobial resistance and other inflammatory conditions, when that microbiome and those species get dysregulated, people have lots of symptoms that are very uncomfortable, make daily life quite challenging. It leads to changes in the absorption of nutrients. And with fecal transplants of these populations, that's been a quite effective method to treat. And so that plus the evidence that we know from the antibiotics kind of space and the probiotic space, all of these, we know that there's a good effect that can be had from just making small changes here. That said, I will say we're very in the early days. I think we're still just starting to, scratch the surface in terms of what's known about how each of these populations affects XYZ. And so to truly understand those linkages and understand how to turn the knobs, I think we're in the early days. But there's a lot of interesting science, and I think in the future, interesting engineering to be done.
Sure. And back to this world of ingestible electronics, are these, you mentioned use cases which are largely therapeutic, which are largely diagnostic in some way, right? You're mostly making measurements around the environment. What sort of therapeutic ideas could be, sort of pursued with an ingestible device?
You could imagine micro robots that, travel down the tract and provide energy in the form of mechanical, electrical, chemical, optical stimulation. And these could impact the musculature. They could also impact the nerves and activate them or inhibit them to then have more global effects on that organ. So I'll give you a very simple example. In gastroparesis, the stomach musculature and the nerves actually are dysregulated. And so they don't send the right signals to induce the peristalsis that mixes mechanically your contents in the stomach and then pressurize the stomach and then, expel the contents to the small intestine. And so when that process stops to happen, that food either leaves without ever being processed or just stays resident in the stomach and has a very hard time leaving. That leads to uncomfortable sensations and obviously some malnutrition. To fix this, one of the things that we worked on was to develop electrical stimulation systems that could actually be placed in the lining of the gut. A colleague of mine worked on systems that could be ingested, that could electrically stimulate the gut. And by simply nudging the nervous system, we can actually reactivate those peristaltic motions and recreate that functionality of the gut. So that's like an example of how you could stimulate for therapeutic function.
Good. Let's come to before we move on, a student that is interested in, this broader discipline of therapeutic electronics, what would you recommend as early training, and where would they get started, and what are some exploratory courses you would recommend?
So physics, math, I'd say, have a very solid foundation there.
Good.
And then anatomy, physiology, biology. If you're able to take a class in gastroenterology at a medical school or nursing school, something like that, where you really get that perspective from the medical side, that's very helpful. When I started my postdoc, I actually just bought textbooks on gastrointestinal physiology that were usually, studied by medical students, and started reading those to get a very deep understanding. And this allows you to then understand the roots of the problems and work at those. I would say applied classes where you get hands-on experience building devices, projects with hands-on components are also very helpful in developing the skills to troubleshoot and, critically think about how you build something. I'd say those are the main sorts of classes that would be helpful for those.
And of course, training in biomedical engineering on electronics is almost required.
Yeah, right, of course.
The the holy grail in this whole discipline has been the brain, right? And to get to therapeutics and diagnostics of the brain, what are some commercially available ideas there, and where is the academic world in that space?
In the brain, deep brain stimulators for epilepsy have been very successful and are a good example of a brain-computer interface in some sense. Although traditionally, I think the BCI population tends to think about other sorts of information entering and exiting the brain. And so we're very interested in reading, for example, motor signals to, say, control robotic devices. In that sphere, BrainGate is a large consortium of researchers that had implanted the Utah array, which is a set of electrodes that go into the surface and read motor signals that are being produced. And then those can be used for moving robots. There's been a lot of speech decoding, and it's very interesting. People can actually think about what they're about to say if they have a disorder that prevents them from actually producing that sound. And the brain-computer implant, the BCI, can actually take that information out and then using processing some algorithms can turn that into text. And very human-like speech at very low latencies, which is very exciting. So those are maybe two examples of successful, brain-computer implants. And then you'd ask, where is the field headed? There's now a number of startups that are kind of working on similar, end goals of being able to produce movement, produce speech with different types of interfaces. So flexible sorts of arrays that sit on the surface of the skull that can be more minimally invasively implanted. Neuralink, of course, is another example. There are flexible interfaces that are now being tried for other parts of the body to record signals. Meta, of course, just came out with the neural band, which records EMG signals, so from the muscles, to decode intent from your fingers for gesture control. There's an endovascular implant from a company named Synchron. So they're sending up a electrode array through a catheter, and it sits in one of the blood vessels near the motor and sensory cortex in the brain. And so by just being adjacent to that tissue, using the vessel as kind of its highway, they're recording signal from that motor cortex and able to decode speech. So these are just some examples.
That's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating and mind-blowing. Again, for someone that is wanting to go down, a student wanting to go down this path, what would be some recommendations for academic training?
Pick an engineering discipline, a traditional engineering discipline, and get great depth in it. So whether that's mechanical, electrical, computational, computer science, whatever it is, get solid training in that, and then in parallel take classes in physiology, anatomy, medicine, the specific subfields that you are interested in. So if you're interested in neural engineering, you should take a neuroscience class. You should start learning about the types of diseases that you would like to work on, the conditions. Take classes in those. Take hands-on classes, project-based classes that merge these two disciplines. Go shadow clinicians. Go shadow patients. Volunteer at rehabilitation centers or nursing homes or wherever these patients live that you eventually want to work on. And then I think read a lot of the literature to understand what's happening in the space, where the interesting problems are. But I would say you can really attack these sorts of biological problems from many different angles. So pick the specialty that really speaks to you and start there.
And to go down the route of let's say starting up, go down the route of entrepreneurship, how important is it in this field to have clinicians be your partners or at least available as advisors?
I think it's very essential that they're in the conversation from the get-go. Like I mentioned before, it's hard to make a meaningful device, a meaningful impact in this space without really understanding the pain points of the clinicians and the patients, in addition to their workflows. So you could develop a very nice device, but if it doesn't fit within their natural user flow, it's possible that it will never be used. And that's not because the device isn't useful or engineered well, for example. It has more to do with the practicalities of implementation in the complex healthcare system that we live in. Being in this interdisciplinary space, one thing we have to accept is that each discipline, for example, operates a little bit differently. They have their own priorities, their own funding structures. Progress in one field may not be looked upon favorably in another. The pace can be very different. Some fields are going to prioritize advancement in the science a bit more than the engineering. And so being really successful in doing interdisciplinary science, I think, means accepting some of that friction and being willing to work through those parts and getting these different spaces to interface and work together. And so along those lines, I think having clinicians or patients as part of the process from the beginning ensures that you've vetted that your technical and functional specifications are, truly the ones that you want to have, and that you're building in such a way that eventually it will be implemented seamlessly.
Sure. I think in India, what we are lacking are fora where young entrepreneurs can meet clinicians. I think that's still work in progress in some way, where if there are organic fora where these conversations can happen, I think what the products are more likely to be heading in the right direction. Let's switch topics and talk of haptics.
Maybe to add to that just a little bit.
Yes.
Some of that work, I think, has to be, if you want to work in an interdisciplinary space, you have to take that upon yourself. So, for example, in my lab, I have our students actually go and shadow clinicians. And, it's a kind of an extra piece of their education, but spend time with the clinician, go sit with them during their regular clinic days, during the days that they're in the operating room, understand what their life is like, where the problems are. And actually some of those experiences for me have been incredibly educational, because you see many things that are a pain point in that context, but can be solved with engineering tools that we already have. So it's a place that, it also sparks a lot of ideas. But the process of finding those clinicians, setting up those shadowing experiences, finding the patients, setting up time to talk to them, we invite patients. It is a process, and I think you have to take that upon yourself. It's not easy to organize a priori, and part of that is because we're so specialized, right, into these areas. So these events where you bring together clinicians, engineers, have them talk, very useful start point. But to really deepen on that, you have to take the effort and make it happen. I also invite patients to our lab, actually, to just come speak about their experiences, what they would like to have technology solve. And those interactions have been very, I think, insightful for us.
That's a very, very good point. I think shifting the burden of proof, burden of sort of activity back on the actual entrepreneur who needs to make this happen. I think that's a very important point. There's no shirking away from that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about movement science. You're a Bharatanatyam dancer. Where did you start learning dance, classical dance?
I started learning dance from my mother and guru, Sujata Srinivasan, when I was about 5 years old.
Wow. And you're a very accomplished dancer. You've recently performed here in the December season as well. What did dance teach you in this whole process of, understanding life, understanding the body, understanding the mind?
Couple things. The mind-body connection and a sense of deep interoception. So when we move, our body's receptors and mechanisms make it very effortless for us to be able to manipulate objects and know how that body is moving. And this is all happening almost subconsciously. You're not processing how to move. Learning in dance how to make that movement very optimized for it to flow gracefully or, have punch, for example, requires that you surface those subconscious mechanisms to a conscious level to break them down and really analyze and then start to optimize, fine-tune, practice, understand, and learn new motor skills. And I think in many ways, my scientific research has paralleled that, where you're understanding mechanism, breaking it down and building it back up, whether that's through surgical reconstruction or engineering new devices, for example. Dance also taught me a lot of resilience. It taught me that progress is very nonlinear. Growing up, learning this art form, I remember receiving a lot of criticism, a lot of feedback for years, and constantly being broken down teaches you a level of stamina, thick skin, to just keep working until you are able to see that next inflection point. Mm-hmm. And I think especially with the arts, initially you get a lot of progress. It feels like you're learning a lot. You have a lot of new movements, etc. And then there's a plateau phase. And it can be very hard to accelerate from that plateau because no matter how much you practice, learn, train, you may not see a lot of progress. And I think that's actually a very useful life skill for me, which is just that you have to keep at the process and enjoy the process and not worry so much about the result and just trust that it will happen as long as you're engaging in the process honestly and with the right training and guidance. And so I think those are kind of big skills that have really helped me in my life on various components. Yeah.
And the idea that everything in life, research or any sort of development happens through a series of inflection points. It's a nice view of how progress happens in some way. You're always hitting these flat spots that are at best gradients of very, very slight gradients, and then you sort of have a ramp up or some discovery, some development that works for us. Along the way, how do you build the resilience in your own mindset when you're at that flat spot? Because you have no visibility of when next inflection point is. Do you rely on your past experience and say, I have been through this? Is that how you draw your courage when you're on the flat spot?
Partly, yes. You look at your own experience, the experience of others. You rely on the guidance of mentors to tell you that this is just how it will be for a while. But I think bigger than that, I have really tried to detach from desiring those inflections and desiring an output, desiring an achievement and outcome, and just really focus and love the process. And so the question I often ask myself as well as others is, are you enjoying what you do day in, day out? And if you are, then it really sort of doesn't matter. And that inflection will eventually happen. But those inflections in the grand scheme of things, it's like are very infrequent. So if you go on a hike, for example, you may only spend 10, 15 minutes at the summit. 6-8 hours are just, focused on one foot in front of another on a rocky terrain. So it's really about going on that journey and enjoying that journey. The summit, it may be there. You may get to the summit and it may be a cloudy day. So you can't really control those things.
Sure.
So for me, it's really about like enjoying that one step in front of the other.
The enjoyment is for us. The inflection points is for the outside world, largely. Because what we do through these developments benefit the outside world. What benefits us most is the day-to-day enjoyment. It's a very, very nice paradigm to have to lead a fulfilling researcher's life.
Yeah, because most of research is failure, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And troubleshooting and Yeah.
Let's come back to movement science, which is, the science of movement, without complicating matters. Where are we with understanding the brain motor and motor control function? Are we able to sort of stimulate motor control, stimulate motion in people where it's impaired, or how far are we from there?
Yeah, both at the level of the brain and more so in the periphery. I think we do know the targets that correspond to activation of a given muscle in a given joint. And we know how to stimulate them to then create activation and movement and composite movement. And this is predominantly done through electrical stimulation. Electrodes, like cuff electrodes that are placed on nerves or muscle electrodes, intramuscular electrodes or epimesial electrodes, can sit on the target organs and be activated in a specific sequence to then recreate movement. In cases where you have a lot of muscle loss or nerve damage, we think about how do you bypass the area where the damage is and then stimulate more distally downstream to then activate the function that you need. Now, challenges in this field are that with a lot of electrical stimulation, we often see that the body fatigues very quickly. This type of stimulation is a bit unnatural. It activates our body's muscles and nerves in a way that is not similar to the way that the body itself activates it. And so I think, the research field is working on how do we tune this, how do we optimize these stimulation methodologies to be most biomimetic. And that's an area of, research. Exoskeletons have come a long way, I think, in assistive robotic devices, so wearables paired with internal stimulation mechanisms. And so blending kind of components from the mechanical, electrical, engineering spaces. Some very, very good strides in restoring movement for people who have small motor disabilities, things like foot drop or weakness, all the way to full paralysis, where you need to take over. Now, all of this said, I think implementation and widespread adoption of these technologies has been slow. And there's a question of, do these really work well enough such that they are worth the weight of wearing them, the inconvenience of putting them on, taking them off? Challenges include being able to sense in real time what the environment is and understand motor intent. So, for example, if you have a patient with paralysis and they want to reach and grab a glass versus they want to grab something else, like we still don't have a full sense of intent. And that needs to be acquired at the brain. And although we have technologies for that, integrating all of these systems hasn't been done fully seamlessly yet. Another big challenge is feedback. So while we can move the limbs, returning that feedback to the user, to the system, so that it can close the loop is still a big challenge in this space. So, academically, I think lots of progress in terms of implementation, widespread adoption by patients. We're still in the early days there.
When I, let's say, have fever, I ingest a pill of paracetamol, the pathway for a paracetamol to reduce my body temperature is pretty well known, and it's rather universal. There is nothing different largely from subject to subject. Some may be intolerant to that pathway. But in the spaces you are describing, where we're looking at motor control, or even going back to the ingestible electronics, Is there a problem of personalization in that it may work in one individual because there's a specific neural pathway that is more enabled in that individual than others?
To a large degree, from movement in the periphery with the limbs, it is very similar between individuals. The only intersubject variability that you have has to do with the specific anatomy of nerve fibers. You know, which branch is going exactly where varies a little bit from patient to patient. And so when we're getting very specific and trying to target just one branch, then there's a challenge of finding that exact branch. But by and large, it's very similar across subjects. And I think now we have very smart ways of calibrating and adapting our algorithms to account for those personalization needs. That said, for things like rehabilitation, for understanding a specific individual's level of dysfunction, those things still require personalization, but all challenges that I think we can overcome with some good calibration, algorithms that are adaptive to that. Yeah.
Okay.
The gut is much more variable. I think, but that has to do with our inability to fully sense physiological state. It's much more of a complex organ with many more pieces. And so to date, we're tracing very few biomarkers to really localize autonomic state. But that too, I think the physiology remains pretty similar between subjects, yeah.
So it's just a question of increasing the dimensionality of describing the problem, and you believe it could be it could be localized in that increased dimension space. Very nice. Let's talk about haptics, which is another holy grail that's been discussed for a very long time. Tactical feedback and all of such. Where is the world there, and what are some interesting ideas that are being discussed in that space?
Haptics have been thoroughly implemented in consumer electronics to provide simple feedback on, what app you open, whether you're scrolling at the right rate, right? We see this in our cell phones. We also see it in watches. And so they provide a constrained level of feedback, but very useful for certain tasks. I think once we enter the rehabilitation space, the movement science space, there's been a lot of research in haptics for various applications.
Because when I grip something, there is a haptic feedback loop that's activated automatically.
Mechanically and electrically recreating that feedback has proved to be very challenging. The body's pretty good at learning new patterns and adapting neuroplastically to understand what's going on. But I don't think we have been sophisticated enough in our engineering for that type of feedback to really be very useful for patients that have, say amputation or paralysis and need quite a high level of feedback. So for simple tasks like have you gripped or not, it works great. Sophisticated feedback is still very challenging. And I'm not sure that we can electrically or mechanically create sufficiently selective and specific signals that it will be acceptable and useful to the body.
Like I'm imagining a surgeon, let's say using one of the Da Vinci robots to do their surgery, also experiencing haptic feedback in some way. That was sort of that is the holy grail still, and it was as well.
It is, and I believe some of those devices incorporate haptic feedback, which is very helpful. Yeah.
Okay. This whole work, the body of work we talked about for about 45 minutes now, falls at the cusp of multiple disciplines. And you talked earlier about how students should sort of think about their own training if they want to sit at the interface of multiple disciplines. What are some traits, some personality traits that you think even students in high school should try and develop so they can be ready for this world which is becoming increasingly multidisciplinary?
Developing a very high stamina and resilience is very important to work in this space, as well as understanding the difference between breadth and depth and developing sufficient depth in, say, 2 or 3 key disciplines that you want to integrate. And so at a young age, balancing curiosity with really diving deep, I think, is important. But I would say as a young person that's interested in doing this type of research, you shouldn't be afraid to explore and explore early in your career. Sort of sequence your learning. So early on, do a lot of exploration, try out many different fields, see what, speaks to you. But then at some point commit to one or two and then dive very deep and try to master them. Too often I find that engineers with a traditional engineering background want to come in and work in this biomedical space, but don't thoroughly engage with the human, the biology, the physiology, the medical side of things, and end up with some sort of superficial selection of a problem or solution. So I think engaging deeply. And then, as I mentioned before, I think reading.
I think in India, this culture of shadowing a physician has not large, except, obviously medical students shadow physicians, but engineering students learning from shadowing physicians is, for me, one of the takeaways from this conversation. I think we should create platforms where physicians can welcome engineering students, and engineering students feel welcome and desire to go spend time during a summer or during a break in a physician's office. I think those sorts of unlikely meetings are very important for, sort of making a life at this multidisciplinary interface.
Yeah. Consider internships in these different spaces that may not be directly on your pathway.
Yes.
But that could be a nice side turn that you later integrate. Steve Jobs, famously said you can never connect the dots looking forward, only backward. And I think that's absolutely true for this type of work.
Right.
You have to seek these opportunities and make the most of them. And you never know when later it will, integrate into something that you build or think of.
Right.
And so being a little bit more open-minded and broad at the beginning, I think is worthwhile.
That's a great suggestion. That is a great suggestion. Let's talk broadly I have two more topics to talk to you. Broadly about graduate studies, right? Agnostic of medical, biomedical engineering, other professions. Who would you recommend should go to a graduate school? Or is it almost getting to a point where graduate school is not optional anymore?
I think if you are very interested in diving deep into a subject and wanting to be a leader, a thinker, and a creator in your eventual profession, you need to go to graduate school. Having the capability to critically think and, most importantly, troubleshoot with a high level of uncertainty and, abolishing that fear when you have that uncertainty is the core kind of skill that you get from graduate school. And so when you're at a company or in academia and you need to solve a new problem and there are no, sources of guidance or no guardrails, being able to navigate that situation and having a process and a methodology for it is something that you learn in graduate school. And so if you don't want to just be employee number X that is doing a certain process and following something, you need that independent thinking capability, which is what I think graduate school trains you in. A master's, I think, is something that almost everybody at this point who wants to be in a very technical field probably needs, just given how fast we are accelerating with technology. I think the PhD is for folks that really want to lead and be able to think and create independently.
Okay. The last line of question, the last line of conversation I want to have with you is with the women in science and engineering. India has been fortunate to have a high enrollment of girl students. It's gone up significantly in the last maybe 15, 20 years. At the high school level, at the high school graduation outcomes level, there's almost exact parity. With college graduation, we're about 40-60, so at the undergrad level. But the career paths that women seem to choose in India is very different. I want you to talk to our women students out there and tell them why it is important to sort of pursue, research or pursue advanced studies and sort of stay with the discipline.
I had a lovely time during my PhD, exploring, learning, You get to build things, you get to break things, and that sort of internal sense of freedom and curiosity and exploration that you have is just such a fun place to be. And I think if for nothing else, you should go to graduate school to just have that incredible time. It's just really fun. And beyond that, equipping yourself with those skills allows you to really make much further strides once you have that independence. And so as a young girl or a woman in the field, there's so much opportunity, so many interesting problems to be worked on. And you have the resources in this country to do it and to really rise up. I look at so many of the leaders in my space that are female that have made incredible achievements and incredible progress in their subfields. And they're an inspiration to how I think about approaching the own problems that I work on. And so I would say, there's the world's your oyster. Like, there's so much to be done. Go forth and conquer. And graduate school is a way to, progress in that with a lot of, with really equipping yourself with the skills to lead in your field. And it's just a fun time.
But when you look at high school, at the high school graduation, among the high school graduate population, the gender ratio is roughly 50-50. At the undergrad, it comes down to 40-60. Graduate school is nearly 30-70. And if you look at faculty across India today, we are under 20% women faculty members, particularly in engineering. Sciences are a little better. Talk to why it's important for women to go into faculty positions. You have chosen that path. I really want to see the gender ratio, improve as best as it can.
Psychologically, at a young age, you develop neural circuits that shape the way you think based on what you see. And so it's unavoidable that context and environment shape how you feel and think about the world. And so seeing women lead in this space, having female faculty advisors, was important for me to see that pathway. And so I think going into faculty as a woman is another way that you can then lead the next generation of folks to come in and inspire and impact the world. There are a lot of problems that as a woman we have a specific perspective on, right?
Yes.
Every stakeholder brings their own perspective. And I think, as a woman, we have a different perspective on the world. And it is worthwhile to include that into the mix so that we have solutions that work for everyone. And so even from that standpoint, like, it's important for us to consider stepping up and getting into those leadership positions, and to integrate that perspective, that opinion, that approach into the engineering landscape. And that's, I think, another important reason that we should seriously consider being on the academic route.
There's certainly a unique perspective. We need all of the unique perspectives to, solve the problems of the future. Shriya, this has been a fascinating conversation already. Your closing thoughts on what you want to tell students in the way they should be thinking about their careers.
Sure. Many of the unsolved problems in our society require interdisciplinary approaches. We need to think creatively and integrate perspectives, various perspectives, to tackle these problems. And so become well-trained in these sorts of disciplines, start to think about how you can integrate them, and engineer your creativity with, the different fields that may be able to help you solve a given problem. I think the world is full of opportunities and very interesting problems to solve. And so it's like, go forth and conquer.
Thank you. I hope that message leaves us all excited about this world where engineering is truly helping people lead better lives, healthier lives, longer lives, and be more fulfilling with their time during the day. This has been another episode of the Professor Mahesh podcast, your resource to help you make informed career decisions. Until we meet again, be well, do good, and keep in touch. Goodbye.